Hello ladies and gents, and today marks a very momentous day in world history, officially the start of World War I. Now most of the commemorations and celebrations occur around November the 11th, but I've decided to do it a little bit differently this year on the start of the First World War. So what better place to remember and commemorate than the Imperial War Museum, which will come to see. We're not covering the whole museum today because I've only got a set amount of time, but I've come to see a certain thing and experience a certain thing and take yous along with me for the ride. So yeah, as I say, a momentous day, 109 years since the start of the First World War. So join me inside. Just here you are looking at the face of George Drury. On the 25th of April 1915, the SS River Clyde ran aground at V Beach, Gallipoli. The plan was for 2,000 soldiers inside to charge quickly ashore. Things went disastrously wrong. The landing bridge to the beach failed, despite the efforts of Midshipman Drury and leading shipman Sampson. Commander Unwin, who had thought up the plan, tried to make up a temporary bridge. He and able seaman Williams hauled two small boats to the front. The landing soldiers met intense Turkish fire. Hundreds were killed or wounded. Midshipman Mellison later swam through gunfire to improve the situation, but it was hopeless. Only after dark could the soldiers land in safety. So, here is George Drury. Once you're put in that situation, you just carry on. And here is his Victoria Cross. What a privilege to be able to come and see that. Now, Gallipoli was where my nan's Uncle Joe was killed. And it was at the same year, 1915. I'll have to check the date. I'll put these details on at the end of this video as well. But yeah, the main two heroes I want to focus on is a national hero, George Drury, and one in my own family, which is Joseph Lumley's Jr. So a little more of George's story now. And the landing at V Beach in Gallipoli, V Beach in Gallipoli in 1915. So here he is. And here he is, our local hero and the national hero, the man himself, George Drury VC. This is a little colourised image. I've just added a little splash of colour to bring some life to it, and it really did bring his eyes to life. I thought I liked that, but this is the original image. Midshipman George Leslie Drury VC, Royal Naval Reserve, was born on the 3rd of November 1894 in Forest Gate, then Essex, now London, to Thomas and Mary Drury. He joined the Mercantile Marines after leaving the Merchant Tailors School at Blackheath. Early during his service, he was shipwrecked and spent 14 days on a desert island, living on edible roots and shellfish. He joined the P&O as an officer cadet in 1912, and in the following year he entered the Royal Naval Reserve. Called up for active service in August 1914, he was appointed midshipman aboard HMS Hussar. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the first Royal Naval Reserve Merchant Navy Award, for his outstanding gallantry in the famous landings from SS River Clyde and on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 25th of April 1915. He later achieved the rank of lieutenant and was killed in an accident at Scapa Flow, Orkney Islands on the 2nd of August 1918 and was buried in the City of London Cemetery. But what events or actions caused George to be a recipient of the Victoria Cross? And this is what we're going to discuss a little smidge of now, which is terrible and interesting. Here we see an original World War One photograph of the SS River Clyde at V Beach on the Gallipoli Peninsula, showing the disembarkation ports cut into her starboard side. Because this was an ordinary ship beforehand and then taken over by the Navy, and they adapted a lot of them. They cut them to pieces and turned them into landing crafts and all sorts. Yeah, but the actions that led George to be a VC recipient, the landings at Cape Helles, was part of the Gallipoli campaign. The amphibious landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula by the British and French forces on the 25th of April 1915 during the First World War. Helles, at the foot of the peninsula, was the main landing area, with gunfire support from the Royal Navy. The 29th Division was to advance 9.7 km along the peninsula on the first day and seize the heights of Achi Baba. The British then planned to capture the forts that guarded the Straits of the Dardanelles. A feigned landing at Bulair by the Royal Naval Division and a real landing at Anzac Cove were made to the north at Gaba Tepe by Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Before dawn, a divisionary landing was made by French forces at Calais on the Asiatic shore of the Straits. After dark, another demonstration was made by the French at Bezika Bay. The Helles landings were mismanaged by the British commander, Major General Alma Hunter Weston. V and W beaches became bloodbaths, despite the meagre defences, while the easy landings at other sites were not exploited. Although the British managed to gain a foothold, their plans were in disarray. For 2 months, the British fought costly battles to reach their first day objectives, but they were eventually defeated by Ottoman defenders. And here we see George on the right, George Drury, with fellow midshipmen Wilfrid St Aubin Malleson and Greg Russell on Imbros, photo by Ernest Brooks, beg your pardon. And it's an old box brownie photo, and it's nice to see these because in the era of studio photography in the Victorian and early Edwardian era, you didn't often see smiles on faces because you had to stand stock still and compose your face completely straight because of the exposure time. But when better cameras came along, like the box brownie, you could see smiles on faces, and it's nice to see that all three of these men have a smile on their face. But look, you can see these ships in the background. It's a real good piece of social history, this image, it really is. Promoted Acting Lieutenant, Royal Naval Reserve in November 1915, Drury was appointed to the Orion-class battleship HMS Conqueror, and here we see HMS Conqueror viewed from off the port quarter. And it's packed with sailors. You can see another piece of social history. But George was awarded the Sword of Honour, and here you see it above, and the inscription. This Sword of Honour is presented by the Imperial Merchant Service Guild to their member, Midshipman, now Sub-Lieutenant George Leslie Drury, Royal Naval Reserve, the first officer of the Royal Naval Reserve, and the Merchant Service to win the Victoria Cross. And this sword was awarded to him on December the 1st, 1916. Royal Navy Officer's Sword of Honour and scabbard as presented to Sub-Lieutenant George Leslie Drury, VC, Royal Naval Reserve, on the 1st of December 1916 by the Imperial Merchant Service Guild in acknowledgement for him being the first Royal Naval Reserve officer to win the Victoria Cross for his bravery as a midshipman during the initial landings at Gallipoli at V Beach on the 25th of April 1915. And see supplement to the London Gazette dated 16th of August 1915, and you've got the issue and page number. That's where this comes from, this bit that I've just read out. So that's from an original article. And as I say, George was unfortunately killed in an accident at Scapa Flow, and he was buried in the City of London cemetery, in a private grave. This is his grave, and this is a picture of it, of course, but we will be at some point going to the cemetery to do proper tour videos and things, so George will of course be one that we cover. Here's the close-up of the inscription: in loving memory of George Leslie Drury VC, Lieutenant, Royal Naval Reserve, won the Victoria Cross April the 25th and 26th 1915, killed in active service August the 2nd 1918, aged 23 years. Life's work well done. And it was well done, poor man, and he lost his life far too young, didn't he? But what a hero, eh? And George, of course, has his own private tablet at the foot of the War Memorial in East Ham Central Park, which was added much later on in our lifetimes. But here is the War Memorial being unveiled. East Ham Central Park, Monday the 10th of July 1921. And you can see, look, the men of the old East Ham Battalion, clergy in front, and family members right at the very front who would have lost people. It's packed there, but yeah, this is the unveiling of the War Memorial. George's tablet and the tablets of the other recipients of the Victoria Cross were added much later, as you can see. But this is a photo I took when I was there of George's tablet at the foot of the memorial in East Ham Central Park. And I wanted to end us off with my favourite image of George Drury VC, and see he proudly wears his Victoria Cross, and this is him on the day he was awarded his Victoria Cross. As you see, his ribbon is blue, and that is because it's the Royal Navy, Army Forces. It's like a reddish burgundy colour. Yeah, that's George Drury VC, a national hero. Now on to your everyday hero, who's one of my ancestors. Now he died 5 months after George, but at Gallipoli, in the same campaign, trying to take over and gain a foothold on that. And as I say, he was an everyday hero. He wasn't well known or things like that, but I've got a lot of information on him, pictures and things like that, so that's what we're going to go on to now. So you've had your national hero, who's of course George Drury. Now we're going on to the everyday hero, my great uncle Joseph Wanless. And here he is, your everyday hero, Joseph Wanless Jr. This picture is of him in the very early stages of the First World War. He was among many of the men that joined up voluntarily very early. He was injured, and this picture was taken of him in the military hospital in what was known as their hospital blues. They were given a uniform of very pale blue, so when they were on the streets, the men would not be accused of being cowards and not being in their military uniform, because that happened if, first of all, when men were injured, they were sent home with their normal clothes and handed white feathers in the street. So the military soon issued them with pale blue uniforms so that people knew that this man had been fighting for his country and was injured. But yeah, this is Joseph. The old black and white photos make them look quite old, don't they? But bear in mind, he's only in his 20s when this image would have been taken. And I think I said in my part of the video, I think I had his birth certificate. It wasn't, it's his brother James's birth certificate I've got. But here's Joseph's birth entry from Free BMD, which is Free Births, Marriages and Deaths. And it's got the quarter, March 1887. And I know Joseph was born on the 9th of March 1887. Registered in Poplar, but he's born in Cubitt Town, Barkew Street, just off of Manchester Road. And here is the location. Barkew Street, with the blue arrow pointing down. That street right over to the right is Barkew Street. You just get the edge of it there, but it was on this street that Joseph was born and that he grew up and would have spent the early part of his childhood. The church that you can see in the distance there is the church that Joseph and his sister, my great-grandmother Maud, were both christened in, which is the Church of Christchurch, Manchester Road. So I'll be covering that one soon because it's still there. Yeah, that's Joseph's world where he was born, and he was born to Joseph and Anne Wanless. Now this is the original of this picture, very badly damaged, a casualty of the Second World War, this one. That's why there's not many images of the family from before World War II, because most of it was completely destroyed when my great-grandparents' house got bombed in the Second World War. But this is a restoration that I did on this one quite some time ago. So yeah, that's Joseph's early beginnings, his world and his parents. And now we're going to be off for the next part of the video, which is some documentation that I have that links Joseph and tells us more about him. So off for that part of the video now. Joseph Jr.'s own father, Joseph Sr., who you can see here, he looks an old man in this picture, but he wasn't old. He was he had very pale blonde hair and had lost most of his hair come his 40s. But in this picture he's aged early 40s. The Wanlesses, as my nan told me, all had very pale blonde hair and bluish green eyes. But yeah, sadly for Joseph Jr. and the family, his father, who we see here, died at the age of 45. He was a master boilermaker and he was involved in a nasty accident. Bed rest, obviously he had to rest, got bronchitis, which turned to pleurisy, and in those days before antibiotics, I'm afraid that was the finish of him. And before his death, the family were comfortably off, not rich, but for working class they were comfortably off, because interestingly enough, Joseph's parents were both teetotalers. Anne, who we see here, Joseph Jr.'s mum, her father had been killed in an accident in the 1870s, blind drunk, trying to climb onto a cart in Middlesbrough, where Anne came from, and Joseph here came from Norton in Durham. And obviously that affected them badly, because not long after that they moved to London and signed up the teetotal pledge. And as you can see, they're quite smartly dressed. But anyway, with the death of Joseph Sr., that wrought a massive change in the family's circumstances. The relatively comfortable existence that they'd had was gone. And now we're going to pick up on the Wanlesses just 1 year after Joseph Sr.'s death. So off to that part of the video now. Good afternoon, ladies and gents, and you join me from the inner lair of London Luke. It's blue box time. This is where all my family history documents are kept. Family history is another big hobby of mine. I've been doing that since I was 16, so 20 odd years now, and in this box are all the documents and everything that's got me to where I am. But yeah, to Joseph's life in documentation form, really. Here's his parents, my great-great-grandparents. You can see Joseph Wanless, born 2nd of August 1855 in Blackiston Hall, Norton, Durham. Let's not get pretentious and think that my ancestors were born in some great big manor house. Blackiston Hall was once a great big mansion house. It burned down, leaving only the kitchen wing surviving and the land. Joseph, his parents were market gardeners, and the grandfather rented the land and the building. Then he went to his father and they lived. It was still quite a large building. It had 17 rooms. But it was the kitchen wing of the old Blackiston Hall, and it was still called Blackiston Hall, and they rented that. So yeah, this Joseph here, born 1855, grew up fairly comfortably in his early childhood. What you'd call middle class, working middle class. He fell in love with Anne Dodds, who was most definitely not working middle class. She was a servant, and his parents basically gave him the option, well, it's her or us, and he chose her. So from having a fairly comfortable middle class life where he would have been comfortably off, he went from that to being an apprentice boilersmith, worked his way up all the way to being a master boilermaker, a master boilersmith. They married in Middlesbrough, Joseph and Anne, and in 1881, just 2 years after Anne's death, Anne's father's death, as I already spoke, blind drunk and fell off a cart and got run over, they moved to London. And this is where we pick up on Joseph. The red part is my great-grandmother, but these are all the brothers and sisters. And here we are, is Joseph, just above my great-grandmother.
Joseph Wanless, 1887 to 1915, killed in World War One. So that's Joseph. And as I said, it was his brother's birth certificate that I've got, not Joseph's. But yeah, we next pick up on Joseph, as I said, after the death of his father in 1900, when his dad died. We pick up on Joseph and the family in 1901. Oh, and they are living Nelson Street, West Ham. This is the 1901 census, and you go down the page to where I've marked off in green. Anne Wanless was called herself Annie, so it's obviously a nickname, but apparently from what I gather they did move about a bit because of rent issues, shall we say, so that could explain the little bit of a name change there. But she's Annie Wanless, head, widow, so she'd only been widowed 1 year by this point, aged 45. Now there's no occupation marked there because they didn't like to do it for ladies in those days because they thought it was frightfully common. But if you see up here, look, if working at home, they've got at home for Anne, and I know that she was a seamstress and a laundress. Where born? This is another lie that Anne has told. She says she's born in West Ham, Canning Town. She's not born in West Ham, Canning Town. She was born in Middlesbrough. So, yeah, more evasiveness. But yeah, here's her oldest son, aged 21, and a dock labourer. Here's Harriet, her daughter, single, aged 19. And here we catch Joseph, just there. Our Joseph that we lost in the Second World War. Joseph, son, aged 14. There's no occupation for him at this time, but he undoubtedly would have been working at something because they left school at the age of 12. And all the children are marked down as born in Canning Town, but they were born in Poplar. And there you've got below Maud, my great-grandmother, and James, who's the second youngest son, and he died quite young, very young. He's aged, here we see him, aged 10, and I think it was about 13 or 14 when he died. So Joseph really was the youngest surviving son. As I said, his mother's baby was really, it's a sad thing because what we'll learn of a bit more in a minute. But yeah, this is where we pick up on Joe, as he was known, in 1901. So just 12 or 13 years before the start of the First World War. And now we're going to move on to a little bit more information about what he was up to, where he was and what was going on just before the First World War. And then we'll be moving on to the other documents, which is sadly the end of his life. So join me for this next part of the video. And now we get to a little bit of Joe's life just before the war and what he was up to. This picture, Joe joined up when the war first began and died in September 1915. So we know this picture dates from between July 1914 to before September 1915. So a pretty good date range on this one. And this is the original, how it looked. As you can see, it was very blurry, and I did a lot of work on this one. But yeah, come that time, Joe was in his 20s, a working man. And we know in 1911, from the 1911 census, that Joe was a hawker, which means he was selling things on behalf of a company on the streets. So yeah, that was his occupation then. In 1911, they were living in Custom House in Martindale Road. Joe was living with his widowed mum, Anne Wanless, Annie, as she became known. Everyone called her Annie, so that's probably why maybe why she put Annie on the census as well. And he was living with his sister, Maud, who you can see here, and his brother-in-law, Arthur, my great-granddad. They all lived in a 2 up, 2 down in Martindale Road. They were really close, they got on well, and the brother-in-laws, Joe and Arthur, got on well too. So yeah, that's what a little bit of Joe's life. And this picture is First World War, of course, of my great-grandparents, and great-granddad Arthur joined up as well early on. A lot of men joined up in the old PALS battalions, where whole streets of men or friends or families would join up all together. And the military soon discovered that, unfortunately, whole streets of men and families would be wiped out together, so they soon disbanded those, and you had like the conscription type thing where different men would end up in different regiments. And that's our great-granddad Price here ended up in the Royal Artillery, and Joe ended up in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. Yeah, that's a little bit of Joe's life just before the First World War. So we capture him with his family, his sister and brother-in-law, his mum and himself. And downstairs in the 2 Up 2 Down, his sister Harriet lived as well with her husband and children at the time. So it was a little close-knit community in those days, as things often were. And that was the little bit just as the run up to the First World War. As I say, Joe joined up early like many men did, unfortunately. They were taken in by the propaganda. And now that leads us up to, unfortunately, the nasty and final event in Joe's life. So off to that part and for the documents. And here we are. Death certificate. These are a little bit different to your ordinary death certificates, and at the time they were a little bit of a new thing. So many British citizens, these men, died overseas, and as British citizens their deaths had to be registered. So, Registration of Births, Deaths and Marriages, Special Provisions Act, and it's covered by the 1957, because obviously the laws change and stuff like that. But these were at the time registered as military deaths British overseas. And yeah, you can see this is the official certified copy of an entry of a death. I had to send off for this when I was doing the family tree research, but here we are. Joseph Wanless, private, 22127. He was aged 29. Birth country England. He died on the 10th of September 1915 at Gallipoli, and his cause of death was died of wounds. And that tells you very little about Joseph's death, and the family would have been told very little about Joseph's death or the action that brought it about and things like that. They would have received a telegram. Sadly, with Anne Wanless's mum, and for his sister, and both his sisters, they received that information, and 5 days later Joe's mum collapsed and died of a stroke in 1915. I mean, so it's a hell of a lot happened. So this is the death certificate. We will get on to a little bit more of the story of what happened back here in England when all this came about, because, as I say, we'll get on to more of that in a minute. But yeah, that's Joe's death certificate. And here, this is 21 or 2 years old, this piece of paper, so it is a little bit yellow, I do apologise, but it's been in a cellophane envelope thing, one of those wallet things, so that's why it is so well kept. But my nan, she knew about her Uncle Joe. All she knew is that his name was Joe Wanless, he was in his late 20s, and that he died of Gallipoli. That's all she knew, and she said to me when I first started the family tree, I'd like to know more about him. So this is, I wrote off to various organisations, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and someone from the regiment archives sort of department from the Royal Dublin Fusiliers was so kind to send me the information that we're going to see in a minute. But this page I made myself in loving memory of Private Joseph Wanless, who died Friday the 10th of September 1915 in Gallipoli, Greece. And this I made for my nan, and when she died it came back to me and went into our family tree. But yeah, this is the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Private J. Wanless, 6th Battalion, Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who died Friday the 10th of September 1915. And you've got like the page stuff and all that, IP address or whatever you call it. But yeah, this is what was sent to me very kindly by someone from the Royal Dublin associated with the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. And you've got in memory of J. Wanless, private, and his number, 6th Battalion, Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who died Friday the 10th of September 1915. Commemorative information, cemetery, and he's buried in East Madros Military Cemetery, Greece, in grave 11 or II N 240. Mudros is on the island of Lemos. East Mudros Military Cemetery is situated on rising ground about a kilometre northeast of the village of Mudros, next to the Greek Civil Cemetery. And here you've got historical information, which is interesting about what led up to Joe's death. From its position, Lemos was intimately connected with the campaigns against Turkey during the 1914-18 war. I'll bend that because I'm reading through the camera screen at the moment, so I'll do this and I can read it properly. 1914-1918 war. It was occupied by a force of Marines on the 23rd of February 1915 in preparation for the military attack on Gallipoli. Mudros became a considerable British and French camp, and West Mudros was installed on the other side of the bay. The 1st and 3rd Canadian Stationary Hospitals, the 3rd Australian General Hospital and the other medical units were established in the two towns, and a considerable Egyptian Labour Corps detachment was employed after the evacuation of Gallipoli. A garrison remained on the island. The 1st Royal Naval Bridge was on Lemos, Ibros and Tenedos. For the first few months of 1916, on the 30th of October 1918, the armistice between the Entente powers, Turkey, was signed at Mudros. But yeah, that's just some information about the area and what it was. But basically, Joe and his fellow fighting men, they were embarked in East Mudros, and unfortunately a lot of the records for the First World War were destroyed in the Second World War, and there isn't a lot that's known. But it was one of the big military balls-ups, and apparently one of the ones that Churchill was connected to. Yeah, and he, along with other men, was killed. Now, as we see here, it says died of wounds. Now, what I was told by my nan, that the family story is that someone who knew Joe wrote to the family and actually said what happened. That when they disembarked from their boat or their landing craft or whatever it was, that it was a right balls up, and that there was barbed wire and everything in the water, and they were caught like sitting ducks and shot at. Many of them drowned. But the authorities and the powers that be weren't going to tell these families, oh, I'm sorry, your son's died or your brother's died, because we fucked up, basically. Yeah, that's Joe's story, and how his death came about. Now on to the last little bit of our video, which will tell you the aftermath of how this affected our family and what was going on at the time back in England, and then at the end we'll see Joe's grave. So, off to the next part of the video.
And so, Joe, like many hundreds and thousands of other men, lost his life and gave his life for this country, thousands of miles away from home. And until that news hit the doorstep for his mum and his sister, they would have been oblivious to the fact that their brother had died, their son had died. But as I say, 5 days after the news was received, Anne collapsed and died of a stroke. Now, when all this happened, Maud and Anne, they were living alone. Arthur here, who's Maud's husband, he was away fighting. Joe, of course, was away fighting and had lost his life. All the men were away. Now, Maud here, in the space of 16 weeks, she lost her brother, her mum, and then her daughter, Annie May. All while her husband were away, and brothers and the menfolk were away fighting. So what an absolute hell to have to deal with. But my great-granddad Arthur, you can see in this picture here, round about the same time, just a little bit afterwards that Joe was killed, Arthur himself was badly injured in one of the early gas attacks. And here we see him in a picture. He was gassed 3 times all in all, poor man, before they invalided him out. And this picture is a little bit later on, but you see him here in one of the military hospitals in his hospital blues uniform that he would have been wearing. This is a much cleared up version of the original, which is in a pretty bad state, to be honest with her.
So all that was going on. Lose your brother, your mum, your daughter, and then plops the news on the doorstep that your husband's now in a military hospital, severely injured and possibly might not survive. I don't know what that letter contained, or telegram, whatever it was. So what an absolute hell to have to deal with. And now we come to the last part of Joe's life, and this is his grave. Grave of Joseph Wanless, grave 11N 240. East Mudros Military Cemetery, Mudros, located on the island of Lemos in Greece. And thank you ever so much to the kind gentleman, Stefan, I think his name is Stefanos, I hope I pronounced it right, who sent me this image, who runs the cemetery. I emailed them, I've had this image for a few years now, but I emailed them and it took about a year for them to get back in touch because they get a lot of requests. But he held out a little bit because this cemetery, round about the time I emailed, was undergoing a massive overhaul. Before then, all these graves were marked with was a little bronze plaque, and they were in a bit of a poor state. So the Commonwealth War Graves Commission done a great big overhaul and put these stones in. So this is now what marks Joe's grave. He may be many, many thousands of miles away from home, but please always remember, Joe, you are never far from our thoughts. You're always remembered, mate, for the sacrifice that you made for our country. And it took a long time to find all this information, and it was an honour and a privilege to trace Joe, and as well as to trace George, who isn't connected to me. But they're both linked to the same place in the same year. One national hero with an act of bravery, and Joe here, your everyday hero, who laid down his life for our country. And I wanted to end us off with, we started off with the very blurry horror original, and this is what we ended up with a lot of work and doing and throwing and programs and stuff, all this technology and whatnot. I did a lot of work on this one with help of friends who tell me how to use this technology. A lot of it's programs that you get, and you can clear up a photo and colorize it. And I don't get to choose the colors, but when I colorized this one, I was absolutely delighted to see that when it came out colored, the blonde hair and the bluey green eyes were present, and I thought that was a really nice thing to end off with. So that's a memory of your everyday hero, my great uncle Joe Wanless. Now I hope you've all found this interesting and informative, and you'll no doubt have stories of your own heroes, your family, ones, national heroes that you've read about and know about. The First World War, nearly all of us have got a hero in it somewhere. Hope you've all found this interesting, and thank you for watching.